Hello and welcome everyone to our brief video presentation for the Kai paper. My name is Anika and I will guide you through this brief talk. So in our paper, we investigated in how far there are differences in the perceptions and evaluations of virtual compared to human Instagram influencers. And to clarify what we talk about, let's first take a peek at what we mean as virtual influencers. So these are entities that appear on Instagram, but also on other social media platforms, and they have the same characteristics as human influencers, but they are artificially and computer generated. So they are often run by companies, but on their profiles they appear like an individual that exhibits their personal life to the audience, that has many followers and that has an influence on the followers' attitudes and behaviors. So with these virtual influencers, as you can see on the two profile screenshots here, they are becoming increasingly close to actual human beings, which begs the question in how far we can still see differences in the perceived humanness, perceived uncanniness, and also the perceived trust of these influencers. And given that there are some contradicting results in related literature, we focus on the research goal, how we actually perceive these influencers when we don't know if they are human or if they are virtual. So the research goal is to investigate the common constructs of perceived trust and uncanniness, but also behavioral intentions toward these influencers, as well as the underlying neuromechanisms that may lead to these evaluations in a questionnaire, and see in how far there are differences between these highly human-like virtual influencers and actual human influencers on the Instagram platform. So given or believing that most of you are familiar or have an idea about how we would measure perceived trust and uncanniness and what these constructs are, we would like to talk a bit about the neuromechanisms we looked at in the paper. So we used the EEG device to measure the neural activity, and we looked at the event-related potentials, which are measurable within the first milliseconds after we look at an image or a post. And there are two signals that might be of special interest for us. The first one is the so-called N400 that peaks around 400 milliseconds after stimulus onset, and in related and broader literature, the N400 has been found to reflect or to appear when there is a conflict between what has been expected to happen and then the actual happening. And we can see that both for language-related mismatches, but also for visual stimuli. So interestingly, there is related work on virtual characters, and they found that this signal might also be an indicator for the perceived uncanniness of a virtual character. The second signal that is also quite interesting to take a look at is the so-called late positive potential. The LPP appears or starts around 600 milliseconds after stimulus onset and then goes on for a longer time, as you can see in the graph. And the LPP has been associated, especially when there is a emotional stimulus compared to a neutral stimulus. But when we look at avatars or humans, there seems to be a connection to the humanness or human-likeness of the agent, as well as the perceived trustworthiness of the agent with the LPP. And that means that the LPP is typically higher the more human-like the person is and the more trustworthy a person is. So to see whether we can find these differences for highly human-like virtual influencers when we don't know if they are human or not, we recruited a sample of 22 participants from the local university. We had an almost balanced gender, with 45.5% being female and the rest being male. The average age of the sample was 28 years. and we had 45% of participants with a postgraduate degree, then around a third with a bachelor's degree, and the remaining had a high school or GED degree. We also asked for the Instagram use or the familiarity with Instagram, and we see that most of the participants actually use the platform several times a day, and the others use it less frequently, but they are still quite familiar with the platform and the actors on the platform. So for the procedure of the study, we first welcomed each participant individually in the lab. Then we had a questionnaire with the demographics, and then we calibrated and prepared the EEG on the participant's head. For the EEG data collection, we had an event-related paradigm where each influencer post was presented for 3 seconds, and after the presentation came a question to the perceived trust, perceived uncanniness, and behavioral intention toward the influencer that had to be rated on a 5-point Likert scale. And upon rating, there came a jitter to neutralize the image, and then the next influencer was shown. And each of the influencers you see on the upper half of the slide were presented with each question, and they were also presented to each participant, so we have a within subjects design here. And after the experimental paradigm was finished, we thanked and debriefed the participants, and they were free to go. So let's take a look at the results. We see significant differences in all self-reported results, and they kind of cover what has been found in related literature as well. So we see a higher perceived trust, a higher perceived humanness, and higher intentions to follow the influencers' recommendations for the human influencers compared to the virtual ones. And for perceived uncanniness, we of course see the Conrad or the other way, so uncanniness was higher for the virtual influencers than it was for the human influencers. For the neural results, we kind of spoiled already at the beginning, and we see for the N400 a more pronounced negative peak for the virtual influencers compared to the human ones. And interestingly, this signal also showed positive regression with the intention to follow recommendation and the humanness, and a negative correlation with the perceived uncanniness. So we also support the results presented prior with regards to uncanniness. The LPP was more increased for the human influencers compared to the virtual ones, and we can see that it seems to be a predictor, or at least be related to the intention to follow the influencer's recommendation. So as a concluding remark and as a main takeaway of the study, as we saw, the neural mechanisms that appear in the first few milliseconds seem to have a higher impact on humanness and behavioral intentions rather than trust. So maybe the perceived trust may not be the most important factor when we want to investigate the success of virtual influencers on social media. We also see that even though they are becoming even more human-like, we are still able to discriminate between virtual and human influencers, even within the first few milliseconds after we look at a post of them. So we can see that the EEG shows that the factors uncanniness, humanness, and intention to follow recommendation may be formed in an instant, and maybe the trust evaluation may come after that. So we think we opened a great avenue for further research, and we are open to question, remarks, comments, and any input that you might feel valuable for our talk. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open to questions.